Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, How to Operationalize ICS Threat Intelligence, sponsored by Dragos. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speaker is Michael Gardner, Senior Technical Account Manager at Dragos. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Michael. And Michael, your screen share looks great.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you may be in the world. Thank you so much for joining me today for a webcast on how to make ICS threat intelligence more actionable. Like Carol said, I'm Michael Gardner. I'm a Senior Technical Account Manager focusing on threat intelligence at Dragos. We're an industrial cybersecurity company with a platform offering OT visibility, professional services, and ICS OT threat intelligence. And prior to Dragos, I spent about 7 years in the energy sector in various security roles, always centered around ICS. And I had the privilege to help stand up the first OT-focused threat intelligence program at my former employer. And since coming to Dragos, I work to help other industrial entities do the same while getting value out of their investment in OT threat intelligence. So today I want to cover a couple of key points around threat intelligence, why the threat landscape has shifted to make ICS threat intelligence an important component of a good OT security program, how to take some of those key points and put them into practice, and some key use cases at a high level to actually start operationalizing threat intelligence in practice. So let's start off by covering some cyber threat intelligence foundations for those of you that are looking to begin implementing intelligence into your security program. First off, why are we even talking about this, right? How have we even come to a point where a webinar on something as specific as ICS threat intelligence for the private sector is reasonable? And really the answer to that is the threat landscape has shifted in the past decade or so. So civilian infrastructure has been placed in the crosshairs by adversaries and deemed a viable target to make an impact in both criminal operations and geopolitical conflict. So because of that, it falls on us as ICS defenders to take action to ensure that we're protecting our employees and our customers as best as we can. And one of the best ways to do that is by understanding the threat landscape for our vertical. So who are the adversaries that target us and what do they use? Where are they focusing offensive operations and when do they do it historically? Why are they doing it? How do they do it from a behavioral analysis perspective? These are all the questions we're trying to answer with threat intelligence. And by assessing and analyzing the answers to those questions, we start to develop intelligence that guides us to make better strategic and tactical decisions at all levels of our organization to both secure our crown jewels and, more importantly, protect human life. There are a couple of key things I like to point out about all of this too, and that's that intelligence is not a tool or a data feed. It's usable insight that affords you guidance on decision-making and security operations. So knowing about the threat and what the threat means to you lets you take action to defend your organization more effectively. We love Dragos Worldview. I was a Dragos Worldview customer prior to joining the company. It's an excellent data source to help industrial organizations with a lot of these problems, but it doesn't have to be your only data source. This is not a Dragos webcast. Obviously, you need good threat intelligence to ensure you're prioritizing the most relevant threats to you. And we'll talk a little bit about good threat intelligence on the coming slides. But you have access to a lot of different intelligence, open source intelligence, information sharing and analysis centers, government feeds, maybe even industry trust groups if you can get into any of those. And all those add value to your intelligence program and let you at least get started on operationalizing ICS threat intelligence while you assess what vendors may add additional value. There are also many facets of cybersecurity that intelligence can feed into. So we're not eating the whole elephant here. We're going to talk a pretty good amount about full intel programs on these slides. But if intelligence is new, it's sort of a new goal for your organization, I recommend just picking some areas of focus here and diving into them slowly to start to build out your intelligence process and start allowing threat intelligence to make an impact at your organization. So I want to kick us off here by getting into some components of cyber threat intelligence, because a little attention and planning here will really go a long way in helping you to create an ICS intelligence program with repeatable processes. So first, we're going to cover the primary data sources to help you focus on collection. This is pretty easy to remember. We just have first, second, third, and fourth party sources, but all of them drive value for your analysis. So first party is really easy, and you're probably using a ton of it already. This is information on your network. So your logs, your policies and risk assessments, your incident data, your architecture, et cetera. All of this is intelligence, and that you can enrich it with other sources that we're talking about here to turn all of that data into useful information. Second party are your friends at different organizations in your vertical. So trust groups you might be a part of, information sharing and analysis centers, industry organizations, all of those that most closely align to your intelligence requirements and share similar threats. Third parties where something like Dragos Worldview most likely fits in, along with any vendors you have in your collection right now. This is also certain open source type reporting, government reporting like Department of Homeland Security or US CERT, for example. And then we have fourth party, and this is usually what we call closed source, meaning it might be from the dark web or a leak published by an attacker. And this can enable things like battle damage assessments to further contextualize the threat. And so when you start to combine all of these together, you start to have really foundational collection for your threat intelligence program. And we use an acronym, CART, to describe good threat intelligence. CART standing for complete, accurate, relevant, and timely. This is kind of an important point to note because as important as it is to operationalize threat intelligence, it's equally as important to ensure that threat intelligence is actually good, right? There's obvious consequences with bad threat intelligence in that bad threat intelligence potentially leads to wasted resources by operations teams, and none of us have time for that in security. So complete is pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about sufficiently complete intelligence to guide decision-making. Accurate, again, pretty self-explanatory. Wrong leads to wrong decision, like we talked about above. And relevant is, I actually once heard our Vice President of Intelligence here at Dragos, Sergio, describe this as threats to home routers are not necessarily relevant to a cookie factory, and I think that really sums it up well. And then timely enough for the decision to have made an impact, right? So I joke with some of my military colleagues here at Dragos that I'm as civilian as they come, and a lot of the time in private industry as a civilian, part of a civilian population, a lot of government intelligence can sometimes be, can take a long time before that information is declassified, and sometimes it may not have as much of an impact as we'd like it to. So making sure that you have sources that are timely enough for you to actually make decisions. And this acronym, this applies to us here at Dragos as producers of intelligence to customers, but it also applies to you in the sense of you're producing processed intelligence for your internal stakeholders. So in the same way that you're receiving intelligence that you want to be complete, accurate, relevant, and timely, you need to make sure that you're following that acronym as you produce it for your stakeholders. The audiences for threat intelligence have different classifications and care about different components of complete intelligence. And they're kind of important to consider as you start to build out your intelligence program and operationalize ICS threat intelligence. So strategic intel kind of focuses on the long range, things like your industry threat landscape, defining policy and risk assessment, architecture, even budgeting and acquisition of tools, all of that kind of stuff. And operations more mid-range. So focus on SOC team structure and operational directives, where to assign personnel and what to have them focus on. Is your SOC going to be exclusively monitoring an incident response organization, or do you want to add a threat hunting component, or do you want to give them the vulnerability management directive, things like that. And then tactical gets more into the real-time execution of intelligence. So things like critical vulnerabilities with published exploits, new information on indicators or behaviors from threat actors that are actively targeting your vertical, the kind of things that should be taken on immediately. And then technical kind of focuses more on automation, right? So technical is your tool sets and the implementation of threat intelligence. So things like searching for behaviors in Splunk and triaging alerts, blocking known bad infrastructure, tuning intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, and even enriching threat data. All of those sort of things are technical. So when we consider all of these points around threat intelligence as a concept, we can kind of start to dive into how it actually applies in a literal sense to known cybersecurity practices. So the most recognizable framework we have is from NIST, that's the National Institute on Standards and Technology. So I threw this together just to provide kind of a high-level overview of how some of these points align with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And all of these points that I've made over here on the right can be driven by threat intelligence. So what do we know to influence a positive business outcome at each stage here? And it can get even more tactical in the sense of driving things like threat hunts or ensuring full eradication of a threat in an incident response. But we can also sort of stay more strategic with prioritizing vulnerabilities in their mitigations and patches, or finding ways to increase awareness amongst our stakeholders even. Now, everything covered over here can be supported and enriched when we have a strong threat intelligence program to support the folks operating at each of these stages. So now that we covered some foundational threat intelligence points, I want to dive into why we're all on this webcast specifically, and that is threats to ICS. So I mentioned it already, but the threat landscape has really shifted in the past decade or so. I've said it once before, but I'll say it again. Civilian infrastructure is now a viable target for adversaries with various motivations. On top of that, they've proven intent and capability to carry through with attacks. So it's even more important than it's ever been. Most of us have probably heard of at least one or two of these events, but we know that adversaries even develop ICS-specific tool sets to actually cause a kinetic impact to critical infrastructure. So, we had the black energy and crash override events in the Ukraine in the second half of the last decade, where we actually saw power distribution shut off to civilian populations in the dead of winter. We had TRISIS as the first known malware to specifically target safety instrument systems. If you don't know, those are systems designed to keep plants safe so that humans can actually operate within them. And even Ekin's ransomware was one of the first ransomwares with OT kill processes baked into the code. So ransomware designed explicitly to shut off operational technology. All of this is important for a number of reasons, but first off, you might have actually responded to the news of these events when they broke at your organization, which is really demonstrative of the fact that you used ICS threat intelligence in a tactical way and can continue to do so. And then second off, because they really demonstrate the higher stakes for critical infrastructure. So what does this all mean, right? We hear this over and over and over again, but I don't think the meaning is lost. Defense in depth needs to incorporate OT beyond IT. It cannot be an either or model. It's very explicitly both. And proactive security measures are all the more important when we consider the shift in the threat landscape for industrial verticals. So this is where you can start to derive some points of value from ICS threat intelligence. And as I mentioned before, the stakes are often much higher for OT. I don't like any argument of where InfoSec should focus the most. Civilian systems should always be protected and off limits. Your data should be protected, your financials should be protected, and your power should be protected. But I may be biased with a career in energy and industrial cybersecurity, but when I speak sort of candidly and objectively here, cyber attacks on OT can lead to loss of life. The stakes very literally cannot get higher than that. So it's on us to use every tool in our belt that we can to prevent an impact that severe. And that's up to and including threat intelligence as a key component of defense in depth. So getting a little bit scary there, talking about the stakes in securing ICS, right? But on a more business outcome focused front, what is the tangible value add to actually operationalizing ICS threat intelligence? We covered this from kind of a strategic level, but at a more technical or tactical level, operationalizing ICS threat intelligence actually leads to a number of measurable, tangible points in defensive posture. So detection and policy guidance can be driven with the insight we get from historic campaigns. And that guidance leads to improved defender efficacy, right? As security analysts and operators start to know what to be looking for in response to a threat, their efficacy is improved. And ICS threat intelligence integrated into a security program actually reduces time to recover and adversary dwell time in response to a cybersecurity incident, which is absolutely critical to asset owners and operators. And the biggest point of all here is really just overall reduction in harm to organizations, in the sense that threat intelligence is somewhat of a force multiplier that increases the efficacy of defense operations across several different domains. So let's talk about how to actually operationalize now. We've covered the importance of ICS threat intelligence and some key foundations. So I want to walk through what you can do to start building out your intelligence program, starting with the intelligence cycle. So there might be some people cringing on the presentation right now just looking at this cycle, because if you Google this, you'll find probably a dozen different versions based on what different Intel professionals have found works best for them. But this has always been my approach throughout my time in the Intel space, and the foundations will always align for the most part. You may see an 8-portion cycle. You may see cycles with different stages incorporated here, but the foundations are always going to be the same. And the biggest key takeaway here is that this is a cycle. It is not a linear process whatsoever. So we're always taking away lessons and insights from each stage to drive improvements to the previous stage or to the entire process as a whole. Especially as you start to build out your intelligence program and focus on moving along the maturity curve to further integrate it, this is important to kind of find some key value drivers to add in at each stage. So first up in the cycle, we have planning and direction. This is debatably the most important stage to set yourself up for success with the entire cycle. It really serves as sort of your roadmap for threat operations as a whole. What are we concerned about? What do we have? Who cares? When do we do it? Who is a threat? All of these things are kind of the points to focus on here. And the best place you can start here is with priority intelligence requirements. And something I found really worked well for teams I've supported in the past were a breakdown of IT, OT, and physical. So you get more granular from there, talking about different geographic regions of concern, and then technologies, and then the adversaries and tool sets relevant to them. And another tool that works really well for a lot of Intel teams are threat models. So threat models can kind of be a fancy way of saying spreadsheets or lists, but that's not knocking threat models. They often look like just kind of a list of adversaries, their motives, their malware, and their TTPs and behaviors. And then they're overlaid with information from your technology stack to help you assign a threat score to prioritize collection. We'll cover this a little bit more in some coming slides. And at the planning and direction stage, you also want to be identifying your key stakeholders here. And you want to document them with appropriate contact information. So, for example, if you identify a critical, remotely exploitable vulnerability in an OT device that's used prolifically across your environment, who needs to know about it, and how are you going to tell them? And what do you want them to do about it? All of this should be documented at the planning and direction stage to ensure you know what to do when the time comes, and you can adequately and efficiently respond. So here's just an example of a priority intelligence requirement for an organization with liquid natural gas operations. So we start with the priority intelligence requirement: will nation-state sponsored activity groups target North American LNG operations? Then we go into an essential element of information that is required for this priority intelligence requirement. So have nation-state sponsored threat actors targeted North American LNG in the last year? And then we move on to indicators that would confirm this essential element of information. So the activity groups we know and track would have to have been observed targeting North American LNG in the last year for us to meet this indicator. And specific information requirements identify what we would need to collect to meet this indicator. So for the example here, we would need trusted hunters to have observed our specific activity groups targeting North American LNG at least stage 1 of the ICS kill chain for us to meet this indicator. And this can be anything, but it needs to be specific. So this could be a government or ISAC notification indicating a nation-state sponsored threat actor has targeted LNGs in North America. Or it could be a report from a paid vendor like Dragos, in which we have dedicated adversary hunters who may report on information like this that they've observed. It just has to specifically align to the questions you're trying to answer in this PIR. So this is just a random example I chose, but you can overlay this model that I've used here to start documenting how you would identify intelligence relevant to your operational priorities. And then from there, use collected intelligence that meets this PIR to move along the threat intelligence cycle and incorporate this intelligence into different stages of security operations. We also talked about threat modeling at the planning and direction stage, and there are really several different approaches to take here. But an approach I love is the diamond model, and it's something we use a lot here at Dragos. And I think it's a great example of how you can use modeling to assess threats to your organization. And threat modeling is just a really valuable intelligence tool because it lets you assess threats to your organization based on knowledge of adversary behavior that's relevant to your vertical. So it's not just based on hypotheticals that may or may not be a threat to you. So to put this into practice, we pick an activity group relevant to us. And this can be anything. On these slides, I use a Dragos activity group, but this can be anything of the APT or bear or panda or kitten variety, anything that's relevant to you. But it should be one that we know to have targeted us or similar organizations in the past. And we assess who they are. So what capabilities they have, what their victimology has looked like in recent history, and what infrastructure they use. And from here, you can start to shift down a bit to assess what this means to your environment specifically. So how would you detect the capabilities and infrastructure employed by this adversary? And have we seen it before? And then what improvements to your technology stack would you need in order to detect the activity from this adversary? So this just shows a more complete, but still pretty high level diamond model for a Dragos activity group that we track as Xenotime. This one is kept very high level just for the sake of working well on a slide, but it shows a good bit of how you can start to get a little more granular as you further develop your threat models. So looking at capabilities, we know Xenotime was the group responsible for deploying Trisis in an oil and gas environment in the Middle East. So from here, we would want to look at further reporting about Trisis and the behaviors employed in past campaigns and add that information back into our threat models for further analysis of our defense posture, just for example. We also look at the victimology here. So assuming our organization fits into these molds, we would want to assess the threat based on the likelihood of our organization being included in that victimology. And so what I want this to show is that well-informed threat modeling based on good intelligence can lead to a more efficient and thorough assessment of visibility, detection, and response capabilities for relevant threats to your organization and your environment. From planning and direction, we move into collection, which is where we focus on getting the data we need to turn into information that can actually be used as intelligence. So we look at our priority intelligence requirements that we created in the previous stage and assess where we can collect relevant information to help develop intelligence. A key point here is building out a collection management framework, right? That allows you to better understand your attack surface. So what is in your technology stack in the OT space? Do you have good asset management? And can you get access to the systems your operations teams use to manage assets? Can you get lists of equipment at each site and safely store it internally? What defense systems do you have in place now and who maintains them? Where are your devices physically located? These are all key questions to answer at this stage. And we want to be making sure that we have broad first-party data here. So we want access to internal telemetry. We want visibility into our OT environments. We want strong asset inventory so we know what actually exists there, things like that. And we also want to focus on our second, third, and potentially even fourth-party data sources here. So do we have good specific OT threat intelligence? Thinking about where else can we get value? Are we subscribed to things like ICS cert or DHS CISA? Are we finding OT security researchers on Twitter even? All of that adds value, some maybe more than others, and should be considered in your collection management framework as well. The other thing that can be kind of a challenge is deciding who is going through collected intelligence if you don't have a dedicated intel team. So that's always something good to consider at this stage too. Who's in charge of this? Not every organization can support a dedicated threat intel team. and workloads are often far too busy for actually assigning a dedicated resource, but that's okay. That doesn't mean that you can't begin to implement threat intelligence. It's just especially important to find a balance in who can support some of this to implement and mature threat intelligence processes most efficiently. So once we've collected intelligence, we have to actually analyze it for relevance. So we're remembering the CART acronym at the processing and analysis stage, complete, accurate, timely, relevant. And we want to assess that internally. So we're also turning somewhat raw data into information that can be used with that assessment. So it starts to paint a picture about our threat landscape as we identify what is relevant and also what threats are of more concern to us than others. And a big thing to prioritize here is internal analysis. So can we look for, just as a foundational example, indicator matches? Can we identify similar behaviors described on our systems? Do we have similar assets or architecture that was described in the intelligence internally? If it's vulnerability intelligence or any of our assets on this vulnerable version, all of this is key to identify here. And then the 3-question rule is key here as well, and that being threat, impact, action. One thing I had in a prior role and something I'm finding a lot of our customers do is actually developing an internal rating system to help you prioritize intelligence based on these questions. So you can use a system like this to decide what moves to the production and dissemination phase and what to note as an overall part of the threat landscape and document in your threat models. And not everything you collect will require immediate action, and that's okay as well. It may just be a good thing to note and revisit in the future if the relevance changes. Make sure that you're documenting it into your threat models so that you can assess it again at a future date. And I add this additional point on that the 3-question rule is the most important way to look at relevant intelligence you've collected. So we want to really try to identify what the threat is. What is the real or potential impact if the threat is realized at our organization? What action should we actually take to mitigate the threat, considering both the near, midterm, and even the long term? Should we be making strategic changes to the organization as a whole based off of this threat? All of this is what you want to assess and try to answer as you process and analyze your intelligence. So this is the point in the cyber threat intelligence cycle where we're turning information into intelligence most formally. So this is the production and dissemination phase. We have pieces of information that we've processed and analyzed, and we've assessed it internally, and potentially, if we develop a rating system, even rated it as high enough of a priority to disseminate to a stakeholder. And so that dissemination can come in many forms. A lot of the time they're delivered through like a structured cadence of briefings and a slide deck. It can be certain types of reporting that you do, actual pretty PDF reports that you want to send out. Another big thing here could just be tickets. So if your organization's using Jira or ServiceNow or Freshservice, however your team can engage with stakeholders best works fine here. This is not a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to assess what's going to work best for your organization. So based on each piece of intelligence, you want to determine who it's most relevant to amongst your known stakeholders, which you should know based on the work you've done in the planning and direction stage, right? You should have all of your stakeholders documented, and you should know who this is most relevant to. And a good thing to do here is develop a strategic and tactical mailing list, or even like a ticketing alias, to make it easy on yourselves and to determine if it goes to operational folks, if it goes to leadership and policymakers, or if it goes to both. But I'll caution you here because you want to make sure you're delivering timely, relevant, and high importance intelligence, so you don't end up with a mailing list that your stakeholders filter away into the Outlook abyss, which is never to be read again. And this isn't always the case, but making sure it's actionable as much as you can is really important. So sometimes you may want to be socializing something just for security awareness, but including a specific call to action if you need another team to assess something or to prioritize a vulnerability, for example, and explaining why it's important for long-range consideration to a strategic audience is critical as well. We also want to really communicate the threat here. So again, what is the real or potential impact? Is there active exploitation? What could that lead to based on the assessment that you performed at the prior stage? Did you find any real risk internally during assessment? Communicating all of that is critical. And then the last point I'll make here is following dissemination, you also want to be tracking actions taken by your stakeholders. So this is important due to the fact that it guides you back into the cycle, right? So if your stakeholders don't know what to do with the intelligence, it might require some tweaking on your end to find the right method to drive action. You may have to identify some process hangups earlier on in the cycle that are limiting your stakeholders' ability to actually action the intelligence that you're disseminating. And this is just a quick example of a reporting template. And you can mirror this if you want, you can develop your own, but this is a good way to just continue delivery of high quality intelligence to stakeholders. You know, using a template like this allows for easy, repeatable dissemination of the intelligence you've processed and helps to just concisely communicate the threat and any response already taken, and then any action that you're requesting in a simple 2-page format. This is something I've used in the past and something that I've helped some customers to develop. But as we discussed before, dissemination can come in many formats. A report like this is one way to make it effective. A JIRA ticket may be the sole way you want to disseminate intelligence. You may have the best possible action from your stakeholders by just using some kind of ticket, and that's okay. It's up to you to decide what's going to work best for your org. So finally, we have feedback. This is really important for planning and direction because it helps you to adjust to drive better outcomes throughout this entire cycle. You always want to be revisiting your priority intelligence requirements to make sure you're accounting for new concerns and refocusing on things that your stakeholders don't care as much about. And a good way I've seen this done is to just have a feedback request at the bottom of the intelligence reports. You can just have a link to a team mailbox that your stakeholders can fill out a quick feedback form or just add comments to a report that they received. And it gives you an opportunity for your stakeholders to talk about how a specific piece of intelligence worked for them and allows you to revisit your processes. And another way to do this is to set up an intelligence channel and a collaboration tool. So if you have Slack or Microsoft Teams or Yammer, allow folks to speak openly and honestly about what they're receiving and how it's working, and take their feedback to heart, because it may mean that there are some processes that aren't working well for you. Also, identifying the teams you're disseminating to the most and holding review sessions with them can be a great way to collect verbal feedback. So I actually heard, again, our Vice President of Intelligence here at Dragos, Sergio, on the SANS Intelligence Summit, give a piece of advice where he said to hold one meeting a month with key stakeholders and bring one piece of intelligence you want them to action. I thought that was a great piece of advice. Just set up a recurring meeting, bring one piece of important actionable intelligence that you deem high value and request the action from the teams, and then request feedback on how that and previous deliverables have been received to help you improve at all the stages here. So I keep talking about action on threat intelligence, and it's not lost on me that could sound a little bit nebulous. So to end today, I want to cover some use cases that can provide tangible value when we start to combine them with threat intelligence. And there's good news here, right? You're probably already doing a number of these at your organization. Some of them are foundational processes for cybersecurity as a whole. So when you start to add in the intelligence nexus, you can hopefully start to derive even more value out of these processes and have more fruitful results as you work through them. So first up, we have threat detection. It's often really hard to know what detections to prioritize. Alert fatigue is a very real problem in the SOC. And sometimes you may not even know what to detect on in general, right? And we know that it is impossible to detect every threat in the world. So in order to become more efficient in threat detection strategies, we have to start to scale to incorporate behaviors into detection. So when you have strong intelligence collection, you can start to integrate technical elements from that intelligence that you've collected, like high confidence and recent indicators of compromise, combined with behavioral threat analytics from security researchers into your internal defense systems for enrichment with your first-party data. And this drives higher fidelity detections as a whole. Automation is a big key point here too. So when you start to automate these processes, your SOC analysts have more time to focus on finding threats and in turn spend less time on carrying and feeding for your security tools, which a lot of us on this call have probably struggled with. And that right there is where threat intelligence can really add the most value, right? It enables your security teams to not do more, it's not additional work, but it lets them use fewer things to do better. And the really obvious point here is that higher confidence detections lead to earlier indication of malicious activity on your networks, helping you to prevent operational impact earlier on in the kill chain. So along similar lines to threat detection, we have threat hunting. And especially in the OT space, defenders often have a limited idea of what activity they should actually be hunting for in operations networks. So when we start to use collective threat intelligence to educate hunters on observed adversary behavior, we can assist them in developing more informed hypotheses on where adversaries might be or what they may be doing in OT environments. And while obviously we never want to find any indicator of an adversary in OT, more informed hypotheses can lead to more fruitful hunts with less burn time looking at irrelevant activity. And aside from threat hunting, understanding adversary behavior leads to a stronger SOC as a whole. It helps them to learn what is normal expected versus what may be an indicator of malicious activity. And all of these points about maturing our SOC improves our security posture as a whole. So we talked a couple of times earlier about how threat intelligence integrated into a security program can lead to reduced adversary dwell time and a reduction in time to recover, but this is some suggestions on how to actually put that into practice. So in the event of a cybersecurity incident, much like with threat hunting, incident responders may have a hard time scoping the investigation, and they may have a limited understanding of the OT environment as a whole, depending on your organizational structure. You may have incident responders that cover both the enterprise environment and the OT environment, and may only have sort of a specialty in one or the other. So appropriate scoping is really the most critical part of an incident response engagement, because knowing what is in and out of scope during an active incident determines exactly how efficiently you can respond. And threat intelligence provides insight into past compromises at similar organizations. So having strong intelligence collection means you've started to aggregate this behavior into your threat models. So you can help incident responders define the scope of their response based on the intelligence you've already collected and analyzed. So this can lead to more efficient IR engagements, but it also helps responders to identify additional compromise areas and collect relevant forensic artifacts for analysis. Really improves the end-to-end process of incident response. And of course, most importantly, it helps to speed up time to recover, and it helps you to ensure that you have full eradication of the threat when it's actually time to return the system to operations, which is of critical importance to us in industrial environments. So vulnerability management is a huge headache in the OT space. Legacy systems can make it significantly more difficult to implement patches or to even understand the extent of what is in a specific environment. And on top of that, in the OT space, there's often a need for consistent uptime, right? So waiting for an outage to implement a patch can lead to an unacceptable risk, depending on what the vulnerability may be, of course. So oftentimes, OT security researchers may publish reporting on specific vulnerabilities, which helps you to better understand the true risk. And on top of that, you may identify mitigations to limit the threat until a patch can actually be implemented. And if you have a strong threat intelligence program that focuses on collecting vulnerability intelligence relevant to your technology stack, you can provide this information to vulnerability management teams and asset owners in a timely manner, which leads to quicker remediation. And again, oftentimes without the need for taking an outage, which is of the utmost importance to OT environments. And one additional point, mitigations published by security researchers can even provide you with knowledge of how to improve architecture as a whole in response to a vulnerability. which just sort of leads to continuous improvement to security posture. So it can be a little bit harder to raise security awareness in the OT space. And that's sometimes due to the fact that performers may believe it's inherently more secure than IT due to network segmentation and physical security controls. So strong security awareness campaigns are equally as important to OT stakeholders as they are to their IT counterparts. Sometimes I think the comfort of a locked physical security perimeter for operators and engineers to work in can sort of add a false sense of security, even on a cyber level. So with the insight afforded by ICS threat intelligence, you can use knowledge of how current and past campaigns were carried out to actually educate your OT stakeholders on what they should be doing and what they should be looking out for in order to improve security awareness at the operational level. And then on top of that, setting up a structured cadence of reporting on points like this can help you to better engage your OT stakeholders. And that can lead them to feel that security is an ally they can go to with questions or concerns. You want your OT folks to be able to approach you as security. And I think we all know, security can sometimes seem like this ominous group off in a locked windowless room somewhere, and that they're monitoring your every move and issuing policy violations when you fail a phishing test. So showing your operations colleagues that you are looking out for the systems they care the most about can help to develop that allegiance and sort of a strong working relationship. And again, ensuring that OT folks are comfortable with approaching security with any questions or concerns leads to improved security posture at all levels of the organization. So for this one, fortunately, there has seemed to be an upward trend in allocation of capital to OT security programs across the industrial verticals, especially in recent years with a lot of government mandates that have come out. But it can still be a pain point to security teams who need additional either technical or human resources to improve their OT security posture. So by using ICS threat intelligence to communicate relevant threats and, of course, their real or potential impacts, you can better quantify to leadership the risk they are facing by not allocating further resources to OT security. So setting up a routine threat briefing is a great idea here. And in that, you want to highlight some recent events in industrial verticals and how the impact could have potentially been mitigated with either new or improved OT security tools. And that can help you drive support from executive stakeholders and investment in your program. And security budgets always seem to be a huge constraint, right? So it's up to us as defenders to use every tool in our belt to communicate the threat and justify improvements to better keep our employees and customers safe and our operations secure. So using real world examples collected in your ICS threat intelligence program to make the point explicitly clear as to why your organization needs this further investment is critical at this stage. And this one, as we know, we're still kind of talking about executives here, and our executives have Twitter now too. They read the New York Times with their morning coffee. They're watching, CNN or Fox News or whatever their news source of choice may be, which means that they're often learning about recent events impacting industrial entities as soon as we are. So many times, OT security teams will receive questions from stakeholders or leadership regarding a recent threat and what our security posture against it is. So having strong intelligence collection can help us to perform a complete assessment of the threat and communicate that real or potential risk to our leadership in a timely manner. Again, while also sort of developing a better understanding of the threat landscape and our positioning within it. This also supports our previous use case of driving investment in OT security. So if you're poorly postured against a newly reported threat, be honest. Tell your leadership that you do not maintain any ability to detect or respond to a similar threat. And then, of course, tell them what it would take to get you there. So leave it to them to accept the risk or ask them to improve your program by championing further investment, whatever that may look like. In the security space, you gain nothing by encouraging leadership that your environment is safe, especially when you have a new or very real threat posed. So we've talked about this a number of times, but it's up to us to use every tool in our belt to justify improvements. And that one of those tools may mean honesty, right? So combined with the context that ICS threat intelligence affords us, you can be honest about the situation at your organization and use that to start the difficult conversations. And finally, red teaming pain points in OT are similar to that of threat hunting and incident response. So penetration testers may not have a good sense of how to emulate adversaries in the OT space to accurately assess integrity of defense systems. So the insight afforded by ICS threat intelligence can better contextualize the behaviors that adversaries employ to gain access to OT environments. And that, of course, can lead to more fruitful OT engagements and red teaming exercises. So work with your pen testers to educate them on behaviors, tools, and vulnerabilities that have been exploited by adversaries in recent campaigns that were targeting systems similar to yours. Highlight the behaviors and threats of most concern to you based on the assessments you've performed against your threat models, and encourage red teams to focus on those. And all of this will lead to more appropriate scoping and red team engagement. And it gives defenders valuable insight into adversary tool sets and weaknesses in OT systems that may lead to good hypotheses and threat hunts. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for your time. I kind of joked that I grew up in security on SANS, so taking ICS courses and joining these webinars for years myself. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share here today. It's really been an absolute honor. What we covered today was by no means all of what you can do with ICS threat intelligence, but I hope it provides you with some sort of direction on how you can begin to operationalize and derive some value from ICS threat intelligence to improve your OT security programs as a whole at various different stages. I'm going to answer a couple of questions from the chat, but in looking at the time, I see we're a little bit limited. So I wanted to point you all to my email and LinkedIn on this slide. Please feel free to reach out to me if I didn't get to your question, and I will absolutely get back to you to the extent possible to try and get some of your answer, to try and get you some answers or point you in the right direction as to someone who can help here at Dragos. Stop the share and jump into the Q&A.
And Michael, just a reminder, the attendees can't see the question, so you'll have to read it to them as well.
Got it. Thanks, Carol. I'm just working on pulling it up.
Sure.
So we've got a couple of really thorough questions in here. Carol, you said that we're going to get I can get a dump of these questions at the end, right? I think some
Sure.
of these are a little bit more extensive than we want to answer in the last couple of minutes that we have, but I do want to make sure that I get an answer to everyone on here.
Yes, I'll make sure they're sent over to you.
Awesome. Okay, then with that, Carol, I'm going to pass it back over to you. For those of you that ask questions, I'll make sure I get back to you via email. And thank you so much again for your engagement, for your time. It's been an honor to be here. And thank you to SANS and thank you to Carol for all the help in coordinating this and allowing me to be here.
All right, well, you did a great job. Thank you so much, Michael, for your great presentation, and to Dragos for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.